In an earlier study, we looked at the skeptical theory that the Gospels were written from a long chain of oral transmission. In this study, we're going to look at the alternative model that's in use, which is that the Gospels were compiled from a small number of earlier documents. This theory, of course, is intertwined with the synoptic problem, which is the question of why three of the Gospels are very similar to one another, while the fourth one is considerably different from the other three. So let's get going. You've got four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and three of them tend to be fairly similar. They contain short accounts, fairly summarized pictures of things that Jesus didn't said. They tend to choose some of the same events, and they tend to read in a moderately similar kind of way, whereas John's Gospel picks a different set of events and it describes them in a much more detailed way. So the synoptic problem is, why are three of the Gospels so similar and one of them so different? And that sort of mixes up with this question of how the Gospels were put together. So the synoptic problem is the problem of accounting for these similarities and differences, and a lot of scholars propose that this is because Matthew, Mark, and Luke depended on some shared documents to inform them. And skeptics then use this idea as a way of attacking the reliability of the Gospels. What they're saying is that if Matthew had to rely on earlier documents, then he couldn't be an eyewitness, that in fact they couldn't have been getting eyewitness testimony. They must have been written much later from secondary sources. And hence skeptics argue they aren't very reliable. Now, this idea that there's a relationship between the Gospels, this is the diagram from Wikipedia. They derived the diagram, or whoever it was that put it on Wikipedia, derived the diagram from a statistical study of the synoptic problem published by a chap called Honoré in 1986. And there is the conventional view, and you'll notice that there are two big bits in common. One of them is called there the triple tradition, and that's quite a lot. It's 3/4 of Mark, and heading for half of Matthew and half of Luke. And then you've got another portion which is called the double tradition, and that's just under 1/4 of Matthew and of Luke. And they look at that and say, this is two separate documents. One document is a triple tradition, which was copied by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the double tradition was also copied by Matthew and Luke. So the document theory, trying to keep some kind of proportion to the scale. Mark comes first, they say. This is the most common. There are actually about 20 different documentary theories, but this one's the most popular one. Mark was written first, they say, Markan priority theory, and his gospel was then copied by Matthew and copied by Luke. And there was another source, which they call Quelle, from the German word meaning source, and they abbreviated that with a Q. So that becomes known as the document Q. And the idea is that Matthew uses Mark and Q and writes his stories from that. He writes his account from that. And he has some extra material in it, which is unique to Matthew. Luke has some extra information which he puts in, which is unique to Luke. And that's the two documents here, the two documents of Mark and Q. There's a 4 documents variant of it where it says that Matthew used another document number 3, a Matthew source, and Luke used a further document as well, a 4th document, which is Luke's private source. So you've then got 4 documents. Whether they're documents or whether they're oral is the difference in the 2 documents theory and the 4 documents theory. And that's connected to the idea of forgery, that Matthew couldn't have been the writer of Matthew, because Matthew, the disciple, would never have needed to use all these different documents to put together his gospel. And, well, it's this question: why would an eyewitness need to copy another gospel? Now, we saw earlier on, there's another study that looks at the dates of the Gospels. We saw that Luke must have been written somewhere, probably 60, 61 AD, maybe a little bit earlier than that. Some people place it earlier. Could have been certainly 57 or 58. It's possible, but I think 60, 61 is more likely. But that means that Q, which is used by Luke, must have been rather earlier than that. Now, of course, Mark would have to be earlier than that as well. So it does beg questions about the date. Now, the assumptions that go with this kind of hypothesis is the assumption that some of the Gospels, at least, were compiled from earlier written documents. So that's an assumption. We've got no evidence of these other documents. Q has never been found. There's no archaeological version of it. There's no quotation of it. There's no reference to it in the Church Fathers. But we have to assume it existed. And there are some consequences of these hypotheses. The negative consequences is the idea that the Gospels therefore can't have been written in the manner that everyone supposes in tradition going right up to the 19th century. And of course, the idea that the Gospels then weren't written by eyewitnesses, they're using material at second or third hand. That isn't guaranteed, of course. Someone who is an eyewitness could use other documents because he likes to corroborate what he remembers himself, but it does make it less likely. Of course, there's some positive points to it as well, which is that if documents which were used to write the Gospels, then those documents have to be even nearer to the ministry of Jesus than the Gospels are. So we've actually got an even earlier source than the Gospels. The Gospels are quite early. These documents would have to be earlier still. So the big question that comes up is whether the Gospel writers copied one another. And Wikipedia, of course, has another example there. There it is. And I've counted the number of words that are the same on each line. If you add them all up, the words in red are identical across the two. This is the description of John the Baptist. 63 words are in common and only 3 words are different. If you leave out the first line up there, then you've got only 1 word different in 61 words in common and only 1 word different. So that's a lot. If it's something that's given orally in a different language and translated, that's quite something to get right, to get them the same. It suggests that Matthew and Luke had some document which they both used, and which they copied down. There's a thing that happens sometimes. People write down synonyms when they're copying. So that's possible. The point here, though, is that this is actually a special case. It's the strongest piece of similar text in the whole of the New Testament. There's nowhere else that comes anywhere near this in terms of how similar the writing actually is. Everywhere else, the writing is very much different. This could be a special case. It's reporting the teaching of John the Baptist. There may have been some document around that everyone knew about, which described what John the Baptist was like and what he said, and they could be quoting from that. That doesn't mean that the rest of the Gospels necessarily do the same thing. Now, the statement goes something like that. There's the Wikipedia diagram again. And the first problem is that diagram is actually wrong. If you do a count up, you'll find that it's nothing like what that diagram gives. I spent quite a long time going through and doing my own statistical survey of what happens. And the problem is, first of all, how do you decide where 2 passages are similar, are the same? And the method one, the method that's probably the most accurate one, is to go up to the documents, compare them in Greek word for word, and say how many words are exactly the same in 2 or 3 of the Gospels, and in the same context, describing the same event. Trouble with that is it's incredibly time consuming. That's something that's going to take I know a year or so of just doing that. Second method is to say, well, let's look at an event. Is it the same event in both Gospels? So you might look at the feeding of the 5,000, the description there, and then you count up the number of verses in that where you've got descriptions of the same event. That's easy to do. That's what I was doing. And the third one is to say, well, let's look at things that are similar to one another and count the verses there. So the difficulty in method 2 is, have you got the same 2 events? If you've got the anointing of Jesus by a woman, for example, how many times did that happen? Well, if you look carefully, it actually happened 3 times, once in Galilee, twice in Bethany. The ones in Bethany are 2 days apart. And so you wouldn't expect those 3 to be exactly the same. But if using method 3, you say, well, and they're similar, we'll just count them as though they're different variants of the same story, and you count those as being the same. If you're using method 2, you say, no, they're different events, we'll not count them. But there's always the problem of deciding whether 2 descriptions are descriptions of the same event or of different events. The skeptical critics use method 3. So that diagram ostensibly is based on method 3, but it's actually still not correct. It still overestimates the similarity. If you do an accurate count, well, you can count it 2 different ways. One of them is to say, well, if you've got 2 accounts that look like they might be the same, for example, the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, then you count those as being the same. The other one's a minimal case where you say, unless I can prove that those 2 are accounts of the same incident, then I shan't count them. And you get quite a difference. So just to add to the problem, the verses in Matthew don't necessarily divide similar material in the same place. So what's 456 verses in Matthew, the same accounts only take 421 verses in Mark and only 413 verses in Luke, just to add to the problem. But you can see the difference. If I'm going to be fairly lax about it and say, well, those 2 might just possibly be the same, I'll count them, then I get 528 verses in Matthew that are the same, but I only get 456 verses that are all the same if I only include incidents that I can show are definitely the same incident. Now, really, the minimal case is the important one. This is the one that you might get if you are copying. If you're copying, then you wouldn't just get similar events. You get something that was clearly the same event. So the minimal case one, I think, is the one to really go for. So let's compare that with the Wikipedia account, the Honore account, and you'll notice that the Honore account has rather larger views for the number counts for the number of similar documents, and it's particularly keen. It overestimates the similarities. Particularly keen on getting similarities for Matthew and Luke. Matthew has 257 verses, which are the same as those in Luke, according to the Honore count. I make it 31 verses. Very, very different. Come back to why in a moment. So looking at that as a diagram, there's my comparison, and there's the Wikipedia diagram. Unfortunately, I put Matthew on the other side, so you've got to think of one of those as being reflected in a mirror. Notice that the triple material is slightly less, than the idea that you get on from the Wikipedia diagram. But 46% becomes 43% for Matthew, 76% goes down to 63%, and so on. But there's still a substantial amount of material where the same accounts are covered by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The double tradition, though, more or less vanishes. So a quarter of Matthew and Luke, according to the Wikipedia model, are the same. According to my count, it's only 3%, much, much less. You get a lot more in Matthew and Mark. Nearly a quarter of Mark appears also in Matthew, but not in Luke. It's much more than this alleged double tradition material. But the other thing is, it's not just a question of saying when do they describe the same event. Word for word, they are quite often different. So if you do a word for word comparison, and I'm going to pick one again from in the Wikipedia example, I counted, 30 or 40 of these, and they're all very similar in terms of the amount of overlap. So we're looking at the account of the healing of a leper, picked because it has a particularly high commonality to it, so the accounts are more similar than average. But if you look at the number of words, you'll find that in Mark, less than half of the words are in all three of the accounts. Same's true in Luke. Less than half of the words that Luke has in the account are there in all three accounts. Matthew, actually, it's a lot more of it is common. There's a lot less additional material there, but nonetheless, it doesn't look like a copy. The amount that's copied is, if there was any copying, it's a few words here and there rather than a whole chunk of text. If you're copying, you copy a whole chunk of text. You don't pick out the odd words. Those words include, of course, things like and the, of course, healing a leper. So it's got the word leper, and so on. So a lot of these words that are common are either very common words, like and or the, and a lot of them are obvious words like the word leper. So you'd expect some commonality because they're describing the same event anyway, and you're describing the words of Jesus, the words of the leper. He says, if you will, you can heal me, and Jesus says, I will. Reporting that, you'd expect similar words, and you get them. The other thing is that if you start looking for phrases, you find that the words are put often in a different order. In Greek, you can do that. The sense of Greek is carried by the endings on the words, not the order in which the words are put. It's not like English, where the putting Fred hit Bill is quite different from Bill hit Fred. But in Greek, you would have case endings, and you could put them in any order. It would still mean the same thing. So quite often you get a different order in the description, even these common words appear different places. So it's not what you'd expect if the Gospels were copying one another. It's not evidence really that that's been copied from a common document. There's a scholar called Ita Linneman who has done very much more systematic study than I did. I picked 20 or 30 incidents and counted up the words on them. She's gone over, again, not the whole of the New Testament, it's just too big, but she's done several hundred places where there is commonality, and has found that actually there is not very much in the way of identical phraseology. There counts the number of words, she looks at phrases, she looks at the way it's reported, she looks at which details are in and which details are not in, and she finds that actually it doesn't look as though a copy has been made. It looks as though these are separate accounts of the same incident. The other thing to watch out for is that there are often false comparisons. So one of them that appears in the literature as having been copied from the document Q is the parable of, the pounds or the talents. So Luke talks about the minas, the pounds, and Matthew talks about the talents. they're actually completely different incidents. They've got different stories. One of them's given in Passover week. The other one is given as they're approaching Jerusalem for the last Passover. They're delivered in different places. The stories are slightly different. 3 servants in one, 10 servants in another, and so on. The stories actually fairly different stories. And it seems that Jesus repeated his teaching. Very often he'd tell the same parable many times, different places, different audiences, and he might vary the wording when he said it. So he might tell the same story, but not use exactly the same wording each time. You get the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew, which is given on a hill. You've got the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, which contains a lot of very similar material, but it isn't exactly the same. That's given on a plain in a different part of Jesus' ministry. But again, it's quite likely that Jesus went to many places and delivered something like the content of the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain. So these are actually clearly different accounts. There's hardly anything that they share in common apart from the general teaching. So it's unlikely that they were copied from Q. And there are lots of similar examples to that. The woman who has pours ointment on Jesus and wipes off with her hair and things like that. These are similar examples, but they aren't the same. And you'd expect to find them very much more similar if they were copied from a common document. So the theory that they're copied from a common document has failed. The data simply doesn't support it. Okay, let's go on and see what the argument is that the skeptics use. They start off by saying, well, the gospel accounts are exact copies of one another. They aren't, but they start off with that. So you say, all right, is that okay? Are the gospel accounts exact copies? So we take one particular set of verses and we say, are they exact copies? If we decide yes, they are, they say that proves that the Gospels are copies of earlier document because you've got 2 accounts and they are exact copies. So we say, well, one's copied from another, or they're both copied from some earlier document. And so we say the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. Suppose we discover that they aren't, in fact, copies. The account of Jesus healing leper, for example, very clearly isn't an exact copy. You say, oh, well, that shows that the gospel writer saw an account and then altered it. So it can't be an eyewitness account because he wouldn't have had to alter it otherwise. And whichever way you go, you can't win. You get the same answer. So whatever the data, whether they're the same or whether they're different, the conclusion is the same thing that's drawn up. So in fact, the data is irrelevant. It assumes assumes Markan priority. It assumes everyone's copied from Mark, and the critics say, yes, they copied from Mark, but they didn't like what Mark said, so they changed it. How do you know they copied from Mark then if it's different? Well, they assume it. And the assumption is there in the conclusion. They are begging the question in a really serious manner. The real conclusion that you have to draw is that the Gospels are independent. They're not copied from one another. They're not formed from other documents which existed before, apart from possibly 1 or 2 small details where someone may have made notes or there may have been something passing around. But there's just 1 or 2 small places where that might have happened. But there's no doubt there are some similarities between the Synoptic Gospels. They account for the same things. There are a lot more things that Jesus did that we haven't got written down in our Gospels. John tells us about that. And the Synoptic Gospels do choose a very similar set of events to report. And we need to account for why that should be the case. It's interesting to look at how the material's distributed. So there we are, it's a chart. What we've got here is the number of verses from the start of Luke. Got the chapters there, so it's chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, and so on there. This line here has the chapter divisions. And what I've done then is I have marked the material which covers the same incidents in black. So where Mark and Luke have the same account, then they're marked in black. Where they are materials that Luke has a bit here that's in Luke only and not in Mark, then I've marked it in white. My original diagram is very multicolored because it includes Matthew as well, but I've changed it slightly just to include the Mark and Luke bits. And you can see that Luke, well, there's the nativity bit, and then there are accounts that also appear in Mark. Then there's the Sermon on the Plain and the stuff that follows on from that, and that's a section in Luke which doesn't appear in Mark. You then get another section that appears in Mark, and then we've got this very long section. There's one bit which might be in Mark or might not. It's not clear whether it's the same incident or a similar incident. But other than that, you've got a section which is, it's called Luke's central section, which is not included in Mark at all. And then we get the death and resurrection narrative in the last week, and that's there in Mark also. So it's quite interesting because in Luke it comes in blocks. There's the nativity block. There's a block about Jesus' early ministry, which is also in Matthew and also in Mark mainly. And then there's a section which is unique to Luke. And then all of them have the death and resurrection narratives. If you look at that's me highlighting the bits that don't appear in both their distinct sections. If you look at the order in which the material is, you can see that more or less they're in the same order. It's probably chronological, but there's a big gap. That's the central section in Luke. There's the birth narratives that Mark doesn't have. This is the Sermon on the Plain and the bit that's following that. And that bit there is the Greater Mission, the bit that Luke doesn't have, but Mark does. So it seems to be about chronological, but there's this central section in Luke. My own feeling, and it's something I can't prove, but looking at it very carefully and keeping on thinking about it, is that Luke is arranging things by source. So there are things in Luke's central section which really ought to be some of them ought to be a bit later and some ought to be a bit earlier. The chronology seems to be a bit wrong there. So I suspect that what's happened is that Luke has taken stuff from someone he's talked to, possibly I venture Peter, but I'm not certain. And then he's talked to other people and he's arranged his material by the person he talked to get the information. And that's why you've got this section. Mark just gets his material from Peter, so he doesn't include this other material. If you compare Matthew and Mark, you get a similar sort of chronological bit, but there are a couple of places where it suddenly jumps out of order, and they're dislocations. There are three of them. The third one isn't a very serious one, but these two are fair bits that are fairly a long way out of order. The graphs, of course, that's the first number in Matthew for the start of the account and the first number in Mark, just comparing them. If you put Matthew and Luke together, that's much more random. And it's even more random if you miss out the stuff that's in Mark. So it's pretty certain that Matthew and Luke didn't copy from a common document. If they did, they scrambled it up as well as change it in the order, as well as changing the words. So what do we know? Well, first of all, there's a series of episodes that are recorded in all three Synoptic Gospels, and that suggests that they're selected the same way. However, when you look at the episodes, the wording isn't particularly similar. The words of Jesus tend to be fairly similar, but the narrative that surrounds it tends to be very different from one gospel to another. Well, that's what you'd expect if people heard what Jesus said and made note of it. You get the same words, but the description of it is different because people are describing what they saw in their own words. The material that's common between Matthew and Luke isn't the same incidents, but it's incidents that contain the same teaching. It covers the same kind of ground. And there's an obvious reason that that might happen, which is that the church, well, the early Christian community, used a common set of episodes to explain what Jesus was, what he did, how his ministry went. And that's a set of episodes that Peter uses in his talks, that Mark writes down. It's the set that Matthew is going to use. It's a set that Luke's going to use. And so they all pick the same episodes because that's the episodes that the Christian community, prompted by the apostles, used to teach about Jesus. And then we've got a set of teachings that the apostles are concerned to deliver. And those teachings are the ones that are emphasized, and they've picked episodes where Jesus does these teachings. These are important teachings. Jesus repeats them many times in different circumstances, and he repeats the teachings in slightly different words. So the parable of the towns and the parable of the talents teach the same thing, but he's chosen different words to teach it in on different occasions. The lesson, though, is the same, and the lesson is the important thing, and they've picked episodes that teach that lesson. These are lessons that are commonly taught in the Christian community, again, led by the apostles, who are inspired by God so to do. So, conclusion, the Gospels aren't copied from one another. They are independent documents. Each Gospel writer wrote his own document, but they were reporting things that were commonly reported, so they picked the same incidents. They're not copied from other pre-existent documents either, that they are not sufficiently similar in the wording for that to happen. What happens is they're written by authoritative people with the backing of the apostles, people who knew what had happened. They got back to the source so that they could provide reliable accounts of the life and teaching of Jesus that other people could then use to compare with what was being said and make sure they knew what was happening. And really, that's the only result that's left. When you remove what the evidence removes and see what's left, it's this last final description of the Gospels. And of course, on the YouTube channel, Gospel 9 YouTube channel, we take a look at other studies that show the same thing.